In this video, we are going to take a look at two of the core concepts in AngularJS called compile and link. So let's discuss about compile first. It is the first step of execution or processing of a directive as part of AngularJS application. So whenever I say it is the first step, you can consider like whenever you are using any kind of AngularJS directives, it needs to have some kind of execution or processing which is supposed to happen as part of AngularJS framework itself. So whenever AngularJS finds any of the AngularJS directives, whether those are predefined or custom directives, it actually processes them. And the first step of the process is the compilation. So for our purposes, let us consider I have a very simple markup in this manner. The first thing is that I have div, and inside that I have message. So which means message is going to be my custom directive, which might be defined as follows. So in this case, I am not using any template. So which means I am not using any template or template URL for this case. Just consider it is just a plain directive which has got this kind of markup. And whenever I say the compilation happens, which means AngularJS finds my directive called message and it tries to compile it. And whenever it tries to compile it, it actually loads this entire markup and tries to traverse it. So whenever it loads this markup, essentially we call that markup related to that directive as a template. So in this case, as I mentioned previously, I do not have any other template other than this markup. So this markup is currently treated as the template and it tries to load it. It tries to traverse it. So whenever I say traverse it, which means it tries to find any kind of additional directives it might have. For example, in this case I have message. I might have ngif. I might have ngrepeat or other directives as well. So it is the AngularJS framework's job to figure out any other directives which may be possibly made available as part of the same template or maybe part of any of the child directives as well. So which means this div might have any children or some children, and that particular children or each of those child objects or child markup elements might have their own directives as well. So all of those will be taken into the consideration whenever it tries to compile that directive. Okay. Once it compiles, which means each of those particular directives, whatever it might be finding as part of the existing template or all of the child templates or child directives will be always compiled. So when I say compiled, as I simply mentioned, just simply loads and traverses the DOM. Okay. And this compilation happens regardless of whether it is a built-in AngularJS directive or a custom directive. If you would like to have any kind of code to be executed, which is supposed to be part of the compilation process, then you can define your directive with compile function. So which means whatever the code you write here will be automatically executed during the compilation of that particular directive. So in this case, you can see message is my directive name, and this whole template or this whole markup in this case is going to be made available to this variable called T element. As I mentioned previously, I am not placing any kind of template variable here or template attribute here. So the market itself will be treated as a template, and the same template will be made available in the form of DOM element through this variable called T element. And if your particular template is having any attributes, all of those attributes will be made available through this array called T attributes. So again, this is just an optional compilation function. If you provide that, which means it will be expected that you will be having some kind of code to be executed as part of this compilation process. So compile is a function which can be leveraged by the developer to provide some functionality which needs to be executed while processing or say while compiling that directive. So now that we understood a bit about compilation, let's jump on to link. It is the next phase after the compilation process. So even though I call it as one singular phase, it has got multiple steps involved. It is not just a simple phase which does automatically execute after the compilation. It has got its own job to perform in the form of various steps. So again, we have the same markup whatever I have seen earlier in my previous slide. So we have the div markup, which is treated as a template, and my directive is called as message in this case. As part of the linking process, which occurs after the compilation process. So as part of the linking process, AngularJS framework creates a copy of this template, and we call that copy as an instance of that template or clone of that template. So this is pretty important. As part of the linking process, this whole template is going to be instantiated or cloned into the memory, and that will be automatically done by AngularJS framework itself. And this instance gets created only after the compilation process. So this is very, very important. The AngularJS framework is not going to work on the template directly during the linking process. It actually creates an instance of this template, and the linking phase will be working on this template from then onwards. As part of the linking process, we have three major steps. That is execution of a controller, which may or may not be available as part of directive. So if it is available, the controller gets executed first. Next, we have the pre-linking phase, which gets executed, and we have the post-linking phase, which is going to be executed as well after the pre-linking phase. So we have three steps which need to be executed or performed as part of the linking process. So during the linking process, we have three steps. The first one is the controller attached to the directive if available. The second step is the pre-linking phase. The third step is the post-linking phase. And most importantly, all of these three steps will be performed against the instance which has been copied or created from the markup template which has been configured as part of your directive. And once the linking phase has been completed, this particular this markup or the DOM will be actually gets rendered by AngularJS framework. So the rendering will not happen until and unless the link phase has been completed. Next, now that we have some basic understanding about compilation and linking, we need to understand the process or the workflow on how all of these tasks like the compilation, the linking, which includes controller, the pre-link, post-link, how are they going to be executed and in what direction, and at what times what kind of code is going to be expected from AngularJS perspective to be executed. So this slide is pretty important. Next two slides are the major things which need to be understood by every AngularJS developer. So again, I go with the same template or same markup whatever we used in the previous slides. So that is, I have message, which is a simple directive, and this whole markup is considered as a template. And the first process, as we know, the first step of the AngularJS directive processing is the compilation. And during the compilation, what happens? As we know, it loads and traverses DOM, and the compilation happens only once. That is very, very important. Once AngularJS finds that markup which needs to be processed, and once it invokes the compilation process, the compilation will be done only once for that template. We will never have the same template to be compiled more than once. And the compile process usually returns a link function or an object which actually performs pre, post, and so on. So let us not worry about this third point. We are going to cover that bit later. So let us quickly jump away from this third step. The fourth one is there is no scope currently available as part of the compilation process. This is very important. If you are trying to provide some kind of data to this markup or to this particular template or to any of the elements inside this template, compilation process is not the place to do so. So there is no scope present and you cannot access scope during the compilation process. And at the same time, there exist no instances or clones of the template yet. So that is going to be the part of the linking process. So as part of the compilation process, no instances of the template is created, and at the same time, you cannot have any kind of data to be maintained or manipulated as part of the compilation process. Next, we can have any kind of operations or functionality to be performed against this particular template, which can be shared across all the instances of this template in future. So imagine if I would like to change the border color of this template. Yes, you can change it right away at the compilation phase. The result is that once you modify this template, for every instance or for every clone of this template will have the same kind of DOM which might have been modified during the compilation process itself. So yes, it is still safe to manipulate DOM of this template during the compilation process, where once the DOM has been completed, the same DOM after all of its modifications will be cloned or instantiated during the process of linking. And as I mentioned earlier, you cannot play with the data. And at the same time, you can never have events or event handlers to be registered during the compilation process until and unless those are really related at the template level, which is not going to be the case usually. Next, no DOM of clones available. Of course, there are no instances created, and obviously you will not have DOM access of those instances at all during the compilation process. The next step, as I mentioned, is creation of an instance. So after the compilation has been completed, an instance of this template is automatically created by AngularJS framework, and we call that instance as template clone or even instance template, whatever is flexible for us. And now the controller will be kicking in. Every particular directive or AngularJS directive can have its own controller associated to that. I'm not talking about the controller MSG here. I'm talking about the controller related to message. We can still have the controllers of MSG to be made available here, but that is a different story. We are going to cover that one in my upcoming videos. But the focus of controller here is really related to the message, that is the current directive. So every directive can have its own controller, and that particular controller will be kicking in the moment an instance has been created successfully out of a compiled template. So once the instance has been made available, the controller will be kicking in. The controller of the directive gets executed here, and that is the first step which gets executed on an instance of a template. And during this process, the scope gets created. So which means the scope gets instantiated or initialized, and the developer will have the possibility to modify the data available in the scope or add any kinds of variables or properties or methods to that particular scope. So if the developer needs to provide any kind of data to this instance, controller is the best place to start with, where the scope is really going to be initialized. And as the scope is made available at this stage, you still have the option to manipulate the data as part of the template instance. So which means you can use the scope, or you can use other ways to actually figure out to provide the data to your template. And at this stage, even though the controller has got access to DOM of this instance, it is not recommended to actually manipulate this. So which means, imagine I would like to provide some CSS style to this one. That is not recommended in controller at all. So there is another phase which can be performed for those kind of steps. But if you are on the controller, it is a simple rule that you can never access, or you should not access the DOM of that particular template. That is pretty important. It is not at all recommended to access DOM of that instance within the controller phase itself. Okay, once the controller has completed, the next step is prelink. So the prelink is the next immediate step of the controller, which again gets executed on the same template instance. That is important. So all of these steps, whatever I'm talking on from now, are not related to template, but all of those steps will be working on this instance. So once the controller has been completed, then the prelink phase starts, which again tries to work on the same instance provided by the controller. During the prelink phase, the first thing is that the reference of this element is made available in the form of DOM. So which means the DOM template is made available to the prelink phase. And as I mentioned, the first step, prelink is the first one which gets executed immediately after the controller phase. Next, the scope which got initialized at the controller level is still made available to the prelink phase. So which means the scope is ready at the moment the prelink is getting executed. So the user still has access to scope here in the prelink phase, where he can work with the data during the during the prelink phase itself. So which means if you have scope and if you'd like to modify that scope related data, it is still valid as part of prelink phase. Next, instance is not linked to the scope yet. This is pretty important. Even though prelink phase has got a reference to this template or to this instance, it is not 100% bound. So which means the scope of the controller, the scope created by the controller or the scope which is made available to the prelink is not 100% bound to the DOM yet. So that is very important. And the next one is child elements or directives are not ready yet. So if you have any child directives or child elements as part of this prelink, those are not processed at the moment. So you cannot access any of the child elements or child directives at this phase of prelink. That is also very important. And next, scope can be manipulated. As you have scope access here and the scope has been already initialized during the controller, and as the same scope is made available to the prelink, you still have option to modify the scope related data here, which might be consumed by this instance in future or by any of the child elements of this instance in future. And even though you can work with DOM here, for some reason AngularJS documentation says that it is still not recommended to actually manipulate the DOM in the prelink phase. And the next one, no access to child elements. As I mentioned, the prelink phase doesn't know what kind of children are available as part of this instance, and it is not recommended to try to access any of the child elements as part of the prelink phase. So that is pretty much about the prelink. And once the prelink has completed, then the next step is going to be postlink. So you can see you have the controller, we have the prelink, and finally we have the postlink. So again, the postlink works on the same instance where the previous two phases have been completed. And this is the last phase before render. So which means once the prelink has completed, the postlink gets executed, and once the postlink has completed, it is going to render finally. So during the post, you still have access to DOM element and it is full-fledgedly available, which means the scope related to this instance has been completely bound to that instance. So you have the DOM prepared, you have the data ready, you have the scope and all the data bindings successfully completed and then passed down to postlink. So you have the DOM access of this whole instance element where you can really manipulate the DOM in whatever the way you want it. And all the child directives, you can also see that all the child elements and the directives are ready. So which means all the children, all the child directives have been processed and made available through the DOM. The scope of each and every of the child directives are also linked at this time. So scope can still be manipulated if really necessary, but most of the time we will not be doing it. And At this moment, if you have any buttons or drop downs or whatever, it is safe to add any kind of event handlers for that one. So which means, imagine I have a button and I would like to have on click to be performed and provided in the form of an event handler. So PostLink is the best location where you can add all kinds of event handlers for the respective instance of the template or any of the child elements of that particular template. It is safe to manipulate DOM here. As you know, this is the last phase and all the DOM is ready, all the child directives are ready, all the events can be handled. At the same time, you can change the DOM in whatever the way you want it just before the rendering phase. And this is most important. It is not at all safe to set the data for the child elements here, because the child elements have been successfully processed here, including all the post links of the child elements. You are not supposed to manipulate the data for the child elements. If you would like to provide the data for the child elements, prelink is the best phase. But once the prelink has completed, and if you are in the post link, which means all the bindings, all the scope of all the child elements, including the current element, have been performed already. So we are not supposed to really play with the data related to child elements here. So this is pretty much about the linking process. So you have the compilation process and you have the linking process. So the linking process has got 3 steps: controller, prelink, and PrePost link. And there is something which we need to understand about nested directives. So which means, imagine I have a directive and inside that I have another directive and inside that I have another directive, which means we have nested directives, or say child directives, nested into each other. If such is the case, how the compilation and the linking will be probably working? So the process is pretty much similar, but there is one thing which needs to be noted here. So prior to that, let us jump into a simple example. I have a directive with this markup, and imagine the div with the message. So message is our directive, and inside that I have another child directive, and now inside that I have another child directive. Now if such is the case, how does the compilation process will be working, and how does the link process will be working? Why? Because link itself has got 3 different phases, and we have the compilation phase as well. So altogether we have roughly 4 phases which need to be working on each of these child directives or each of these directives. So we need to understand this process before even jumping into the code on testing. So the first thing is that obviously the compilation needs to be performed, and currently the compilation will be performed on the outermost directive, that is the parentmost directive. So once the compilation phase has completed on the outermost one, then the compilation of the immediate child of the outermost one will be compiled. So which means this phase, the compilation phase, is always the first, regardless of any kind of directive. So if the directive needs to be processed, the first step is always going to be the compilation. So if you have nested directives, the first step is always going to be on the outermost one, and the first step is always going to be the compile. And immediately after that, as you know, the compilation will be loading and traversing all the child elements as well. And while it is loading the child elements, it actually compiles the child elements as part of the same process. So the first step is compilation of the outer directive. The second step is compilation of the inner directive. And once that is completed, it knows that it figures out that there exists another child directive, and it tries to compile that one too. So this is very important. All the compilation phases will be completed first before even jumping to the linking phase of any of the directives. If they are nested or not nested, the compilation happens first before even jumping to linking, regardless of whether they are nested or not. Okay, now that we know all the compilation of all the directives have been completed, now the process goes to the linking process, where inside the linking, the first step is controller. That is the first step as part of the linking process. And the controller of the outer directive will be performed. And as we know, after the controller, we need to have the prelink phase of the outer directive. And after the prelink phase, this is important. It is not going to post. It is actually going to the controller of the second directive. The post is not going to happen immediately after the pre if there exists any child directives. If there are no child directives, yes, immediately after the pre-link, the post links gets executed. If there exists any child directives, the post is not going to be executed immediately. But it will be done later on, we are going to see. But again, as I mentioned, after the pre-link process of the outermost directive, the next step is always going to be the controller of the next immediate inner directive of the outermost directive. In this case, this is the second one. So you can see 1, 2, 3 and 4, 5 are the linking parts related to the outermost one, but the post is not executed yet. It has come to the controller of the inner one, and then the pre will be executed here. And again, the post is skipped because it has found another inner one. So if there exists any inner directive, the post is skipped. It will be actually processing the controller and pre-links of the inner directives first. And once that is also performed, then it knows that there exists no other inner directives, and now it tries to execute the post of the innermost directive first. This is important. The post of the inner directive will be executed first prior to execution of any of the posts related to the outer directives. So the post happens in reverse. While the controller pre-link will be actually going in the form of sliding, the post will be always going in the form of a ladder. So the post link of the inner one happens next, followed by the post link of the next outer one and the next outer one. So that is very, very important. The post is always in the form of a ladder going up, but the controller and the pre-links are the next to each other, which will be always sliding in the form of a ladder. So that is very important. And after the outermost post has been completed, then the render phase happens. We need to spend some time in order to understand this slide, and it is quite simple. All the compilation happens first, next the controller pre-link of each of the directives, and finally it goes to the innermost one where all the post links will be executed in reverse, and finally goes to the render. Okay, so now that we have all the slides completed, let's jump on to some code. So let me open my temp and let me create a new folder called test, and let me open through Sublime. So the first thing is that I would like to have an HTML file to be created. So I go here, new file, and I call this one as a01.htm, and so I have HTML part to be written here. The first thing is that we need to have all the bootstrap, jQuery and Angular to be imported. So in this case I have some helper script here. So the first one is jQuery, and we have the bootstrap and Angular. So let me bring all of this stuff right here into this guy, into this. So which means I have all the Angular, jQuery, bootstrap ready for my application. And the next thing is that I would like to create a JavaScript file called a01.js, and I need to include a01.js right inside the HTML. So I'm going to say script, and in this case I had to say like src, where is this guy? Okay, src equal to a01.js. So in that way I actually included my JavaScript file. So as part of the JavaScript file, the first thing is that I need to have my Angular module to be instantiated. And next, as this is a new module, I would like to have the controller to be specified. In this case, the controller name is going to be message, and I would like to use some scope for this one, along with the function of the controller, the scope, and then function, and of course I can use the scope here. So right now I do not want to write anything inside this controller. I just wanted to leave it blank. So our focus is going to be on the directive. So let's go through the directive first. So I'm going to create a new directive called message. Okay, inside the message, I would like to return an object. And inside the object, I would like to see on how the compile works. So I just wanted to mention like function t element t attributes. So as we know, compile is the first step which is supposed to be executed whenever any kind of directive is being processed. So I just wanted to provide something like console.log, and in this case I would like to say like t attributes dot text. So whatever the attribute I provide here will be made available through my console. So I just wanted to say in compile. Okay, so let me declare this as part of A01. So in A01, the first thing is that I need to have the ng app to be specified. So this is important, otherwise AngularJS doesn't know where to start. So the next thing is div. So inside the div I am going to have the controller, and in this case the name of the controller is MSG, so I am going to use the same controller name here. So the next one is my directive called message, so I'm going to use that directive here, and I'm going to use the attribute. So in this case I'm going to use the attribute called text. So I'm going to say attribute text is going to be first. So this is just for our understanding in this case. Okay, so this is my template. Message is my custom directive, and this is the attribute which I am trying to access right inside this. So as we know, the entire template is available in the form of DOM here, and all the attributes are available here, and this is the compilation phase for which I would like to have some kind of console message to be displayed. So I just save this and see if this is going to be executed at all. So I just wanted to run my web server on this folder, and let me go to the browser. So I'm going to say localhost 8080 a01.html. Of course I have to go to my console, so let me clear everything and let me refresh this. And now you can see I have first in compile. So first is nothing but the value whatever I provided right inside my HTML right here. So this is the value it is trying to display concatenated with in compile. So the next thing, let me do something more. Okay, once the compilation has been completed, now I would like to have the controller to be specified. As we know, we have the linking phase. So during the linking phase, we have the controller, pre-link and post-link. So let me go to the controller first. And the controller, as I mentioned, it is going to have the scope, it is going to have the element access, and it is going to have the attributes if necessary. So we have all the three. But as I previously explained, this is the good place, or this is the best place to start with your data or scope, and you are not supposed to access any DOM in the controller, not even the you cannot modify the DOM here. Of course you can access attributes, but not really try to access the DOM or modify the DOM here. So in this case I just wanted to say something like console.log. I just wanted to get the attributes. So the name of the attribute in this case is text. I just wanted to use that, and I just wanted to write something like in controller. So I just added the controller, and let me refresh this. Okay, I have an error somewhere, so I think probably let me quickly jump. Oh, I should have provided a comma here, my typo. So let me save this, refresh this. Wow. So dollar attributes, I think there is, yeah, I have to use dollar here. Okay, So let me do this. Now you can see I have the compile, which is always going to be executed first, and after that I have the controller. So controller is the first step of the linking phase, which always gets executed after the compilation phase. Okay, so the next one is the pre-link. So the pre-link and post-link are usually written using return, and this return needs to be part of the compile. That is very important. So a return needs to be made available of the compiler as part of the compiler. So the pre and the post are two different functions. So I can have my own function called pre here, and I am going to have the post to be another function. So we need to return an object which contains both pre-linking function and post-linking function, and that object is always going to be returned by the compiler. Even though pre and post are returned as part of the compiler, AngularJS knows that it needs to execute pre and post only after the controller. Controller is related to the directive. It is not related to the compilation. So controller always needs to be made available as part of this return, but pre and post always need to be made available as part of this return, which is nothing but the compilation one. Okay, so as part of the pre-linking one, as I mentioned, you have access to scope and the instance of your template. I call it as I element. So T element, when I refer T element, essentially I'm talking about this guy. This is T element in my opinion, this blue one. And this one is I element. This is what I call it as instance element. So just for our better understanding, so during the pre, I would like to call the instance of the element made available to the pre-linking phase as always I element. And next, obviously, I am going to have all I attributes. And in theory, you also have access to controller, but not everyone really uses it, so I just wanted to skip it in this case. And now you can have the function definition to be provided here. So in this case, I would like to say the instance related attributes dot text, and I am going to say in pre, so which means in pre-linking phase. So the post will also be quite similar. So I just wanted to have the post to be also defined in the same fashion, except that I need to modify this one to post and this one to post. Okay, so let me refresh this. And now you can see I have the compilation task performed. Immediately after that I have the controller, next pre and next post. So in that way you can see that the compilation and linking phases are always executed in a particular order. That is pretty important. And now, as we understood a bit about the pre and post, this pre and post as well as the controller always work on the instance. So you can see that this is the I element I am talking about, and this is the T element I am talking about. So this blue one is T element called as template, and this green one, this box is related to I element, which means during the compilation process, after the compilation phase, this template is going to be converted into form of an instance, and that instance related element is always accessible in the form of I element. So that is what I meant. Okay, so now that we have completed the pre and post and everything, let us now do the nested directive. So I go to A01 here, and let me do something inside this. So I go in here and I go in here as well. Okay, so just for our understanding, I wanted to provide second, I wanted to provide third, so that we know what is going on. Okay, so you can see I'm having nested directives now. So just refresh this guy. Now you can see I have various phases actually being provided in the form of log. It is a bit difficult to understand, so let me actually provide some kind of indentation so that it is easier to understand. Okay, So let me refresh this again. There you go. So now you can see all the compiles get executed first. So the outermost one compile, the next inner one is second, the next inner one is third. So this is the innermost one. So we have all the compilation processes executed first. So you can see compilation 1, 2, 3. So all the 3 are done. Next, immediately after completing the compilation of the third, it actually goes to the first and tries to execute the controller. And you can see after the third compilation, it actually goes to the controller of the first one. And immediately it goes to the pre of the first. And there is no post after pre. It actually goes to the second and goes to the controller. And then pre. Third, controller and pre, and there exists no more child directives. Then it tries to execute the post on the third, then goes back to the post of the second, and finally goes back to the post of the first. So post is always in reverse. Compilation is always the way it is, like the outer, inner, innermost. Controller and pre also go in the same direction, that is outer, inner, innermost. But the post is opposite. Innermost, the next outer, and finally outermost. So that's exactly how I have represented in this diagram, and this is pretty much about how the compilation and the linking phases happen as part of AngularJS. In my upcoming video, I am going to dig into more in depth of compilation and linking whenever we are working with ng repeat and so on.